Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker shills, death slaves, herders, peasants, vassals, enemies of the state, backstabbers, bootlickers. Oh, I said that. I'm a useful idiot, and so there's a big story in the news today for those of us who follow the players, the insiders, the big movers and shakers. And these are the two biggest movers and shakers, the two elitists, the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds. And today they announced they are creating a partnership. And I think technically one could say they've had a partnership for many years. There's a lot of intermarriage between the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers. And even though the Rockefellers have been considered a standalone dynasty in the United States, there's many who also consider them proteges and lackeys for the Rothschilds. So today, in the news, two of the best-known business dynasties in Europe and the U.S. will come together after Lord Jacob Rothschild's listed investment trust, known as RIT Capital Partners, and Rockefeller Financial Services agreed to form a strategic partnership. This is a big move, and it will have a lot of implications. And I'm not surprised with the advance of the globalist agenda and the global socialist agenda that the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers would finally set aside all pretenses and join forces. And the fact that they can do this out in the open now says a lot about the current climate in the world. So RIT Capital Partners is to buy a 37% stake in the Rockefellers Wealth Advisory and Asset Management Group for an undisclosed sum, giving the Rothschilds London Trust a much sought-after foothold in the U.S. This is very important. So that means the Rothschilds will now start getting directly involved in American economics and American government, and not necessarily through their Rockefeller agents. The Transatlantic Union brings together David Rockefeller, 96, and Lord Rothschild, 76, two family patriarchs whose personal relationships go back 50 years. And of course, the Rockefeller Group itself can be traced back to the 1880s when John D. Rockefeller, of course, created a vast empire through bootlegging, involvement with railroads, and the oil company. And the Rockefellers, of course, started Standard Oil Company. The Rothschilds, of course, go all the way back to 1815 when Anselm Rothschilds, or better known as Bauer, started creating the vast empire that we know today. This partnership will focus on setting up investment funds, eyeing joint acquisitions of wealth and asset managers, and granting each other non-executive directorships. And this merger will be handled by Société Générale, a French Rothschild bank. So one of the banks, of course, that has a great deal of exposure to losses right now in Europe, as do a wide array of Rothschild banks in Europe. So I see this as a consolidation of power, a move to get a foothold in the U.S. by the Rothschilds, and very handily it comes in time to cash in on the upcoming fire sale of assets in the U.S. I'm sure they're doing a fine job buying up assets in Europe in the giant fire sale that's going on there. And this is an interesting development in line with several other Rothschild family circle developments of late. The first Rothschild non-family member was named the chief executive of their organization. That's a huge move after a couple of hundred years. And we also found out that Geithner was required to send economic reports about global stability and finances to the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds and to Henry Kissinger. And of course, there's a tight relationship between the Rothschilds and our government already. Of course, the Rothschilds have a controlling share in the Federal Reserve banking system. And Evan Rothschild, when he got married, he actually came and had a penthouse view of the 9/11 World Trade Center collapse, and then spent his honeymoon night at the White House. So this incestuous relationship with our government is part of the Rothschild palette, as it is in Europe. And so we know who the real master is here. I'm sure Obama was made sure that they were weighted on hand and foot, as one would do with your masters. And the other third part of recent developments in the Rothschild circles is the death of Leopold the Rothschild, 84 and unmarried. And he died on April 19th, 2012. And he joined the Rothschild and Sons Bank and was the director of the Bank of England. And he helped reestablish the Rothschilds' Latin American offices in Brazil, Mexico, and Chile. He was involved in a lot of banking consolidation. So they try to paint him as a steam engine enthusiast, a stamp collector, and a philanthropist. But obviously, as a Rothschild, he had his hands in all kinds of banking cookie jars. In fact, Leopold the Rothschild was involved in setting up the World Conservation Bank, which turned into the Global Environment Facility. And they lend money to poor countries through the IMF, and then they take mineral-rich lands as collateral. So when these poor countries default on these generous IMF Rothschild loans, then the Rothschilds scoop up more valuable mineral lands and farmlands around the globe. And this also follows a move recently where French and English Rothschild banking operations were consolidated. So there's a huge consolidation move going on here in the Rothschild banking empire. And their integration with the Rockefellers really says a lot to me about their circling the wagons and consolidating and getting ready to move into a new global paradigm, which of course they have been guiding all along. So I think this is a huge move, and I'll be interested to see what the results are going to be as this story unfolds. Let me remind you, too, about some Rothschilds history. In 1912, just prior to the Rothschilds being involved in setting up the Federal Reserve System in the United States and the income tax that followed, there was a letter written by Nathaniel Meyer Rothschild to his New York agents, and he was introducing the Rothschild banking methods to America. And this is a quote, and it's very chilling. Most people are familiar with the first part, which is, "Give me control of the credit of a nation, and I care not who governs it." But he goes on to say that, quote, "The few who can understand the system will either be so interested in its profits or so dependent on its favors that there will be no opposition from that class, while, on the other hand, that great body of people, mentally incapable of comprehending the tremendous advantage that capital derives from the system, will bear its burden without complaint, and perhaps without even suspecting that the system is inimical to their interests." So these Rothschilds are very blatant about what their intentions are and how they feel about the world. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, they were instrumental in setting up the Federal Reserve System in this country. In fact, the Rothschilds were involved in the setup of the first national bank in the United States from 1791 to 1811, and then they were also involved in the setup of the second national or central bank in the United States from 1816 to 1836. And we have to remember that Nathan Rothschild warned America that if they didn't give another Rothschild charter to a national bank, that they would find themselves involved in a disastrous war. And of course, the War of 1812 soon followed. So we have an indication that they wield so much power that the British and the United States could be put against each other in a war over Rothschild banking interests. And Nathan Rothschild also said at the time, once again, just like his future offspring, "I care not what puppet is placed on the throne of England to rule the empire. The man who controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control Britain's money supply." And so I think, this family, the things it says and the things that they've done on both the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers should be common knowledge to all Americans who want to know what's going on in the world now, because this is the focal point. This is the axis. Whatever the Rothschilds and Rockefellers are involved in, there's speculation that the Rothschilds' current net worth is somewhere between $11 trillion and $600 trillion. So there's a great deal of wealth out there in the world that people aren't aware of, that's squirreled away. And the Rockefellers' combined wealth, I think, is somewhere around $11 trillion as well. And of course, most of that is through banking interests and oil industries and insurance companies. And a lot of this money is sheltered by setting up foundations and trusts. Same thing the Rothschilds do. So it's really hard to track a lot of this money as it's filtered through all these umbrella corporations and subsidiaries and tax havens and trusts and foundations. I noted when I was doing a little research that it was interesting that Anselm Rothschild, his original sons, of course, were set out across all of Europe to set up central banks right after the Napoleonic Wars. And he apparently arranged marriages for 18 of his grandchildren, and 16 of them were contracted between first cousins. So they're a very insular family, very ancestral family, and the fact that they want to intermarry and keep their blood clean and not mix with the peasants is quite a statement on the Rothschilds as well. And I've alluded to early about the setup of the Federal Reserve with the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers were both involved with. In fact, a number of people that were directly related to setting up the Federal Reserve were known Rockefeller and Rothschild agents. Benjamin Strong, Rockefeller agent, John D. Rockefeller himself, Paul Warburg, who of course is a Rothschild's representative, Nelson Aldrich in Congress was a Rockefeller representative, Henry Davidson represented J.P. Morgan, Charles Norton represented J.P. Morgan. So the original shareholders are the same big players that we see on the scene today: Rockefellers, J.P. Morgan, Lazard Frères, Rothschilds, Kuhn Loeb, Warburgs, the Lehman Brothers, and Goldman Sachs. These are the original shareholders in our Federal Reserve banking system that we rely on in this country. So how independent do you really think they are? And it has been established that they do pay dividends, and we have no idea what the actual amount of the dividends would be, but they're going back to the same players who are getting bailed out by the Federal Reserve. And I also think it's interesting, too, that during World War I, none of those banks that I just mentioned, the Rockefellers, the J.P. Morgans, the Rothschilds, Kuhn Loeb, Warburgs, Lehman Brothers, Goldman Sachs, none of them bankrolled France or England. They bankrolled Germany during World War I. Interesting fact, and not surprising considering Paul Warburg was running the central bank in the United States when it was set up, and his brother, Felix Warburg, was running the central bank in Germany during World War I. So this, once again, this is all very ancestral, and I also think it's interesting that Rothschild's protege, Cecil Rhodes, who expounded the ideas of John Ruskin, was very much into the idea of a global socialist government, and created the British Fabian Society. And this British Fabian Society is the organization that was used by the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds to bankroll the Bolshevik Revolution. A lot of people don't really know that, especially Americans who have this fear of socialism, not realizing that that is actually the platform that the elites are after. It's not democracy or a republic. They're after socialism. And so the British Fabian Society and the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds bankrolled the Bolshevik Revolution. They actually put Lenin on a train to go back to Russia and get in the mix of something they'd already started. And in fact, the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers bankrolled the Bolshevik Revolution from the beginning and helped set up the Soviet Union. So during the Bolshevik Revolution, there was a huge loans, and then after the revolution, Lenin transferred a lot of gold back to the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers to pay for the loans, Russian gold from the Tsars. And American companies continued to be involved there. Standard Oil helping build refineries and providing the growing Soviet Union with cutting-edge American technology. So these are hardly people that have any allegiance to the United States, whether it's Rothschilds to England or the Rockefellers to the U.S. They're transnationals. They transcend sovereignty. They transcend borders, and they're interested in the global empire run by them. And interestingly enough, too, Cecil Rhodes wrote in his will in 1877, and he left a bunch of money to Lord Nathan Rothschild to set up the Rhodes Scholarship in Oxford. And of course, a noted Rhodes Scholar that all Americans are familiar with, Bill Clinton. So here's Bill Clinton, a protege of Carroll Quigley, who's an insider and knows about the elitists and the plans and the handlers and the masters. Not only is Bill Clinton a protege of Carroll Quigley, but he's a Rhodes Scholar, so he's well versed in globalization and the undermining sovereignty. And I can guarantee that there's plenty of other people in our government that are on board with that same game plan. So anyway, this is a big move, and I think we won't know exactly what the results of this are going to be for a while, but it's certainly a huge development for those who follow the Rockefellers and Rothschilds as they march through history, controlling all our lives. I think a couple more quotes are in order. I've done a lot of quotes from the Rothschilds. Here's some things that the Rockefellers believe in, of course. One is that competition is a sin. David Rockefeller said that. He also said, own nothing, but control everything. And most notable, David Rockefeller was quoted in his own autobiography that he stands accused of running a secret cabal that would try to control governments and run the world. And he says that of that accusation he admits and is proud of. So these people think alike, the Rothschilds and Rockefellers, and they belong together. John D. Rockefeller also said the ability to deal with people is a purchasable as a commodity, as sugar or coffee. I pay more for that ability than for any other under the sun. And they also said the easiest way to control or eliminate competitors is not to best them in the marketplace, but to use the power of government to exclude them from the marketplace. Of course, we're seeing that. We're seeing that every day now. Monopoly is the name of the game. Antitrust laws are impotent, and they do not try to compete in the marketplace. They don't like competitors. We see major transnationals buying up all competitors because they can't really stand sharing a portion of the market. And this is ingrained in both the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds. So to hear them in their own words spelling out what exactly their philosophy is makes it very apparent to everyone. And one needs to note, too, that the Rockefellers, of course, have had an insidious involvement in every aspect of American society for over 100 years. And they're involved in the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which Nelson Rockefeller created and ran under Eisenhower. And they're involved in all sorts of philanthropic ventures and foundations and trusts that kind of infiltrate every aspect of American life, including our education system. I overlooked the infiltration of our education system for quite a few years, but I've read a lot about it now, and I understand that the Rockefellers have been involved in social engineering and brainwashing for quite some time. And that's one reason why we have a school system that trains our young to be obedient to the state and not to be able to have critical thinking and just be good consumers. So anyway, that's kind of a grand overview on the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds. And I'm sure there's a lot of people who watch me that are more than familiar with all of this information. And if you're not, there's a good teaser to find out more. It's a very interesting story. The Rothschilds basically starting a pawn shop in Munich and finding out that it was more lucrative to loan to governments than to people. And they got involved in that rather quickly and set up central banks all over Europe, controlled most of the world's wealth, and are the movers and shakers. They're at the top. They're one of the top 13 families, and they control everything, and they may be the very top family. That would be my guess. And then the Rockefellers, growing up in much the same way, involved in oil, insurance, and banking, and they control our nation's economic system and are actively involved in affecting every aspect of American lives because they need good vassals. So I'm going to attach a few links to this video because I want to provide at least some information. But I encourage everyone who cares about what's going on in the world and sees all the economic and political upheaval and this growing surveillance police state, economic central planning, rigged markets, This is all part of the plan that's been set out by the Rockefellers and Rothschilds for some time to come. Their blueprint is readily available, and it tells us a lot of what we need to know to navigate these events. And I think it's very important. So anyway, there's big news today. Rothschilds and the Rockefellers joining forces. And I think this is another huge plank in the creation of a global society where sovereignty will cease to have the meaning it does now, and there will be a socialist economic system, centrally controlled, with feudalistic financial districts, and it will all be run by the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers. So, I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.